old ones are, at the moment, only the old ones are uploaded there, right?
Well, these are all the slides. These are stuff that's on the data tracker, and that's the ones that we've uploaded for MeTecho. So Bob's thing is on a GitHub repository. It's not in the data tracker,
Right.
so we can't pick it up yet. And I think Bob was intending not to use any slides because we only have a couple of minutes. This is us. We're at the top of the hour. Certainly.
Audio test one.
Whoever that was speaking, I heard you.
Thank you, Bob. That was Jim. What have I done wrong? Just give us a moment here. We're having trouble with. I thought I had this right.
So you need to click first there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Done.
Ah, that wasn't done before. I must have missed it. Yeah, and I want to share slides. Thank you, Eric. Okay. Are we there yet? No, it's coming. Yeah, come on. Ah, share. Okay. There we go. Let's get started. Do you want to run things? Stefan?
I do I want to run things?
Yes.
Apparently, I want to run things. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the IETF's DRIP session. So anyone who is not interested in DRIP, please leave the room or stay, whatever. Jim and me are here as delegates for the real chairs who attend remotely. If you get me the next slide. We are trying to learn how to get to the next slide.
Eric, could you help here?
Daniel Ahmed, would you mind sharing the slides if you know how to do it?
Okay, so I think
And you
those
have control
are
then.
Jim's.
I have the slides here, but they're not being shown on the screen.
You're delegate, right? So
You go on here.
no, yeah, with the people. Daniel wants to share, but doesn't want to share. No.
Daniel, you need to request sharing a slide with the document icon.
Yeah, that's what I said. Shared preload slides.
Ah, yeah, now something's coming up. And the audio level like this is good enough?
Daniel, I've transferred control to you, so you should be in charge of the screen now.
Daniel, you are good, but at the desk that we can't hear our on-site delegate there.
Aha.
So do you see my slides?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I'm still saying this section is being recorded.
still says it's Jim slides.
Mm.
I think Jim has to stop sharing to let.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have
Yeah, I
the
think you
impression
will have
it's
to
something.
unshare yours.
Sorry about this, folks.
Just heard some key clacking. Somebody's coming through good.
That's me.
Mhm.
Daniel, you have to speak sharing. Oh, we go to try again.
So something good seems to be
Yes,
happening
I
now.
saw something.
No, back to the sessions recorded slides.
Daniel, you are in charge. You should have another window with the left and right buttons.
So I clicked on something shared. He asked me, I had a window asking me whether I want to share or not, and I said yes.
Yeah. And now somewhere in another window, you have the right and the left arrow. Okay, Jim, do it then.
Nope.
I can try. So you go in, share yourself, next one, yeah. Share slide, share.
Doesn't look good for the away team.
Now Adam is also doing some sharing.
All right. I have slide control now, guys. I believe.
Yes, Adam, I think you are under control, hopefully.
So there we go.
There we go.
I'll
See you, not
control
well.
slides.
Okay, I'm muting.
Okay, so this is a not well, unless you have never seen it. So take the time to read it. If you have any questions, please come to see us or contact our AD. Next slide. So these are the rules for how we handle this meeting. That's a hybrid meeting. So we have in-person participant and remote participant. I think that we're not that numerous. And if you have a question, I would say you can jump into the conversation. We are more in a conversation like type of meeting. Next slide. So you have the agenda, Meeteco and other information. Next slide. So where we are. So we have our first RFC being published. And now we're heavily focused on the DRIP architecture. The last call is just being started today, or I hope it might be yesterday for some people. And we have I would say one of the main document, the core document, which is the RID, that is in working group last call. So next slide. So milestones, where we have a few other documents that we need to focus on. It's not the end of the road, but we're pretty good in that. I see the registries. We target to be done by the end of the year. For the next IETF, we think OAuth might be a good target. Pretty confident about that one. The RID was for December 2021, but I mean, we're only in March, so it's an IETF schedule. Next slide. So this is the agenda, and I suppose that Shuai is gonna start. Has anyone wants to say something before we start the presentation? No? So I suggest that Shuai is presenting the DRIP arc.
Android.
Lost control here for a second. Sorry. What slide deck was it for?
That's the arc.
Actually, there is no slides for the first two ones. This is just I would
Okay.
say for the editors to report any last minute major issues they have on the ARC and for the read. There's only one slide from Stu. So if there's nothing to report from the ARC, we can move to the next one. So for Bob to report any I would say last major issue on his side. Thanks.
No comments?
I don't see any slides for Bob in the decks to share.
I don't have any slides from Bob.
And that's what I was saying is that for the first two ones, for the architecture and the read, there is no slides.
Okay.
The slide is only for Stu. It's the last, I would say, sub item. So as
Got
there
it.
is no major issue for the arc, I suggest that Bob can jump in and comment the read draft, and then we can move to Stewart for the STM update.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. So I think, yeah,
Did you want me to proceed with this one?
I believe so.
Okay.
That's what sounded
So
like.
we all know our first RFC has been published, and then at right about the same time as our requirements and terminology were published, the ASTM F-38 committee, which is the Unmanned Aircraft System Operations Committee, entered ballot on two UAS RID documents. One of them is the revision of F-3411-19, which has been the basis of most of our work. There was extensive, okay, it went away. There was extensive work done on F-3411 in order to keep up with the regulatory changes in both the US and in Europe. We didn't have a lot of inputs from the rest of the world. The ballot has since closed a few days ago, and there was only one negative ballot. The way ASTM works, that one negative ballot must be resolved. In other words, either the chair needs to convince the one who filed that ballot to rescind it, or the working group needs to find the ballot non-persuasive, and then a higher level within the ASTM needs to agree with that decision that it was non-persuasive. This may take a while because it's an allegation of intellectual property conflict of interest. Fortunately, the means of compliance, which is a document saying how to satisfy an FAA regulation based upon the technical standard, passed unanimously. The picture in the middle is just an illustration of the flow, if you will, of requirements from external down to our proposed standard drafts. As you know, the architecture draft is just entered IETF last call this morning. There are some nits there. We wonder, and this is not a question for IETF, but I just want you all to be aware of the question, whether we're also going to need to come up with a means of compliance draft to show how our DRIP RFCs, once published, can be used to address the things that the ASTM F3411 standard does not address, which is primarily how to dynamically assign session IDs, ensure that they are trackable by authorized parties only back to the operator and the serial number of the aircraft. And we had a successful field test last summer, which we're going to do another one this summer. And we're hoping at that point to check the interoperability of our prototypes with those of others. And that is all I have. Thank you.
Any comments or questions? Okay then, thanks. I think next item up is...
Any questions?
Sorry. Any questions or
Jim, we can't
comments?
hear you.
Any questions or comments? Nobody? Okay then, thanks. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda.
Which is
going to be-
implementation.
Yep.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me well?
Hi, Andre. Perfect.
A moment to find you.
Okay, so this is an update that we were developing in Linköping University with students regarding the implementation of DRIP protocols. Next slide. So this is our reference architecture. So there is like 5 components: observer with Android application app, the drone with Raspberry Pi and other add-ons like GPS and battery, and then the registry based on Iroha blockchain, which keeps track of drone data, and then there are different types of users that can request this data from blockchain. So next I will describe like the progress of different components. So our code is using OpenHIP implementation of host identity protocol with different additions, and it's a part which is open source. So some changes which are upcoming because of change BOPIT in hierarchical hits format, we'll need to address that. And second part is the mostly Python scripts to handle this registration and lookup messages. So it's not currently published, but we work to do it towards the end of the year. Next slide. So the drone broadcasts things using STM format with DRIP additions based on extension of drone ID, and we experiment with Wi-Fi different modes as well as Bluetooth 4 and Bluetooth 5. We also have registry implementation using Iroha, as I mentioned, as well as extension of Android app to do the lookups based for web server. Next one. So why Iroha? It's a blockchain that is permission based and it has some nice features. So we actually did also some simulations to understand what kind of number of drones it can handle, and it's quite promising. So it's like, let's say, 100 of drones within a certain limited geographical area is supported in terms of transaction times and processing times and so on. And next, it's also, next slide, please. It's also supporting some of all the requirements that are specified in the DRIP registry draft. So I hope it will be also included as one option in the future of revision of registries draft that Adam is promoting. Next. So I'm now going to talk briefly about our experiments with Bluetooth 5. Quite many devices claim now they support Bluetooth 5, but it seems like not all features are actually supported. So for example, Raspberry Pi 4 is not really supporting it well enough. So we're trying to experiment with a dongle and development kit RF52480 to sort of test the range and other features. Next slide.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you say it does not support, what is not support exactly?
Well, as you know, there are different profiles. For example, long range Bluetooth 5 or low battery Bluetooth 5. So it means like it maybe supports some limited version of this.
Okay.
So,
right.
if you don't mind, Andre, I'll expand on that a little bit. Basically, a lot of hardware chips will support Bluetooth 5. The spec is an extension of Bluetooth 4, but all of the extensions for Bluetooth 5 are optional, the only one being backport to Bluetooth 4. So you could have a chip that supports all the new features of Bluetooth 5, but then the firmware running the chip doesn't, and then the software above that at the OS level doesn't, and then the software above that doesn't. So you get this layering problem of the chip will support all the stuff, but then stuff above it won't. And so you have to find the right match to do it. So for example, the only phone I've found that supports everything we need for Bluetooth 5 is Samsung Galaxy S10 or S20 smartphones.
Right. So we were trying to address this, for example, by plugging this dongle into Raspberry Pi 4, and but as you said, there are some complications on firmware and driver level. So we only had limited success with that so far. Next slide. But yeah, we have a script which using Python extensions, and when it's depending on which communication interface is active and available, it will try to send Wi-Fi beacon mode or Bluetooth 5 or 4 and so on. Next slide. So for Wi-Fi, it works, but it's a short range, maybe some less than 100 meters. So we're also looking at the neighborhood awareness mode, which is getting support in the recent phones. However, people like Bob pointed out that now Wi-Fi beacons is a way to go, but I'm not sure what's the level of support of that in the recent hardware. We have to investigate. Next slide. And this is the observer application. It's based on OpenDroneID extension. As you can see, it successfully receives H hits from the drones and displays location as well, allows to query the database, the registry based on user credentials. Next slide. And regarding the Bluetooth 5, we did some measurements. It's not so easy to find like 1 kilometer open space in Sweden, so we actually had to go to a lake. And with this development kit, we were able to reach about 1 Nordic mile distance, which is already much better than, let's say, 100 meters with Wi-Fi. So once we kind of resolve this compatibility issue with Bluetooth 5 in different devices, hopefully it will be good means. Next slide. So as you see, these are components we have to combine and put it like add-on to let's say a phantom drone. So there is Raspberry Pi 4, when there is battery hat, and then there is GPS. So all of that should be like mounted on a drone to actually transmit this ID data. Well, now actually there is model B of Raspberry Pi 4, so I hope it will have better Bluetooth 5 support, so maybe we can do without a dongle extension, so simplifies things. Next slide. And regarding OpenHIP, it's currently hosted on Bitbucket, so you can download the code there. Next. So one of the things we were trying to do is to add support for OpenSSL 3.0, because it's like the latest crypto library, which has all the latest ciphers and hashes and so on. And OpenHIP is it's historically based on OpenSSL 1.0, and when it was extended a little bit to 1.1.0, but still like not the latest one. Next. So it was kind of challenging because Open Heap uses a lot of sort of deprecated calls, which are now not supported in SSL 3.0 anymore. And when you start changing one part, it sort of leads to dependencies in the other parts. So it was like basically almost rewrite of a code because it was like thousands of warnings and other stuff. Next slide. But we kind of finished the update, so the code is compiled, but it's not well tested yet. So we are maybe in autumn we will work on more automatic tests to sort of and packet format tests to make sure it's like interoperable and compatible to the latest RFCs. Next. Also, we were working about NAT traversal implementation. So you see this RFC 9028 is relatively fresh from July. So again, we finished basic implementation, but more testing is needed. But I'm curious to see your opinion. Like, is it really helpful for DRIP? Do we need to go like over UDP and use ICE, or we assume that we can have like always direct heap and IPsec in all cases? Maybe at least for the kind of remote registry access, maybe it's useful. Next, so we still there is something to do. So there is like data relay server implementation to do, and update the core simulator that we used for these use cases. Next, please. So what we are also doing is we are trying to do formal verification. Like I know, for example, Bob likes this idea that the security protocol should be formally verified. And last attempt to do it for HIP, I think it was like 10, 15 years ago. So we are now using more modern tool and also implement DRIP features. And also we are involved in several EU projects, which are targeting to do big scale demonstrations, like almost a drone flying taxi or ambulance. So for example, there are some test beds planned in Norway, Stavanger, and in Helsinki. So try to put some of our prototype and hardware to these drones to broadcast remote ID. And Xorus Quam is another example that is also like large scale demonstration. So we plan to fly a big drone between two cities in Sweden beyond light of sight. So maybe one of first operations like that. And it also would be nice to have DRIP as part of this thing. And the final slide, please. Yeah, so this ARMOR is focusing on emergency medical services, because based on surveys, it seems like it's kind of application area that most people will support the adoption of drones, even if it's noise and some other features. And you see there are some Chinese models like Ihang, which is already purchased and being tested and in Norway. And we, of course, waiting for some authorities' permissions to actually start flying people in that. So it's ongoing research and active area in new space in Europe. So that's it on my side. If there are any comments, questions.
Thank you, Andre. If anyone's got any questions or comments, could they please put their hand up in the Meet Echo chat and then identify themselves when they speak. Also, if someone's speaking at all, please say who they are for the benefit of everybody in the room. Stuart is taking notes, and I'm sure he recognises everybody's voice, but there may be other people taking part in the meeting. Sorry. Stuart is taking notes of this meeting, and he probably recognises everybody's voice, but other people are in the room here or on the internet somewhere else might not recognise who's speaking. So if you identify yourself when you come to the mic, thank you very much. We have a first question from Daniel.
Yeah, so I have one question to Andrew. It's a I mean, I don't see the migration to OpenSSL 3 as a huge challenge but I just want to check if I am correct.
Well, in
It's
terms
always
of code,
difficult. I mean, but it's,
yeah, I mean, it's if you have like legacy code, it's like a lot of update. It's almost like rewriting from scratch. So I'm not sure
Okay.
about other people using heap. Are they going to do VMRate or?
Okay, because that's okay. That's not the RIP. That's on the hip side of it.
Yes, but you need heap,
Okay.
right, for registry.
Yeah. Sure.
documentation.
Yeah. I forgot this. Okay. Thanks, Bob.
Pointing out, as I said in the chat, that the value, one of the big values of HIP for the UA is going to be for network remote ID and command and control, and not being locked into a single connection methodology. He has demonstrated this already in his test over at the UAS test site there in his neighborhood there at Griffith International Air Force Base. We presented that in previous sessions. So you may think that this is orthogonal, the open HIP discussion, but it is going to be important as we move forward to the next steps in being able to well support the activities for where we go beyond the basic broadcast messages and we start moving on to the network remote ID and support for better support for command and control. And that's it.
Go ahead, Stuart.
To clarify, while command and control itself does not lie strictly within the scope of the DRIP working group, initiating applications based upon identity does. And so that would include so-called detect and avoid, command and control, vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle, etc.
Daniel?
Andreas presented one implementation. I guess two, and Adam as another implementation. Did you do some interoperability test, or are we aware of any other implementation at that point? And maybe if that's possible, Adam or Stu, can you just let us know what you're implementing? I mean, are you doing the equivalent of Andres, or is that more restrained or more specific? I mean, if it's possible, I'd like to have some more detail. I would be interested.
Okay.
So
Is
just a
Adam
brief time check here. We are about 10 minutes late right now, so keep it brief, please.
Adam, do you want to take this or do you want me to?
Please go ahead, Stuart, but be brief.
Okay, so I'll make it very quick. Adam and others at the New York UAS test site are doing a tremendous amount of work in prototyping. Unfortunately, the nature of our funding is such that it is a struggle to get any of it openly released. We will continue the struggle.
Thank you, Stuart. Next up.
All right. Yep. Thanks. Hope everyone can hear me. So I'm going to go over two topics today. I'm going to go over authentication formats and also the registries. So I'll start with authentication formats because that'll be pretty quick on us. So changes since 03, the FEC section is now fully filled in. It will need somewhat of an extensive review. There were a couple small things that were changed on two of the formats. Appendix A was fully filled in with some diagrams and some text, and Appendix D was added to do Med's comment. So there's still some pending issues. As I said, FEC needs to get reviewed. I've noticed that with Reed Solomon, especially in my implementation, that you need a specific polynomial on both sides for the forward error correction to even properly work. And I have run into an issue where I've had colliding polynomials. So we might have to actually specify one in the draft. I'm not sure how to approach this, so I'd like some guidance on that, or we can just work on it as a working group together. The Appendix D was to directly address a comment from Med. Hopefully it satisfies his comment along with a conjunction with Appendix A. And then I need to loosen some language. There's some weird language during some transition where manifest became the required and thing, but it used to be wrapper, but it seems like both can be used. So I have to just fix some of the wording around in that to get it right. For next steps on this draft, I'm going to be sending it internally in AX Enterprise to Laura Welch for an English language review. She's very good at English, and maybe not so much on the technical side, but she'll be able to read through the draft, make it readable to humans that are not technically as savvy, and help find any major issues. I actually just got the sector review right before this meeting, so I'm going to be responding to Rich after this. He's given some great comments, and I believe we're ready for working group last call, although the chairs can put their own opinion out on it. So anything discussion-wise on auth from anybody? Otherwise, I'll continue straight into registries. I'm going to take that as nothing, so I'll go right into registries. So this is the registries draft. We're on version 01 now from 00. So changes from 00. This was a massive rewrite on my part. The first push was an absolute mess. I hated the document as it was, so I took some time, about a week and a half, and really cleaned it up, reorganized it. There's some new sections in the introduction to get a high level view of like a story of a typical life cycle using the registries in DRIP. There was a whole section of attestations and certificates that was moved down into the appendix because inline it was getting really clunky to read the document. There was some text added for key rollover and federation of registries, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And there was an attempt at merging high-level points from the DEET Section 5 into the Section 4 of this document. I'm going to be working more with Bob to make sure that I got all the pieces needed for that and massage any text there. The big change from this was Sections 7 and Sections 8 of 00 were merged into one section, Section 6, so they got a lot cleaner in formatting and was more fleshed out. Section 7 in the original document was extremely technical and just very hard to read, where Section 8 was more of prose and like a story on how registration works with the inner components. They've been melded together in a lot, hopefully an easier way to understand. Also, EPP and RDEP sections were added, and any examples that were shown in the EPP section have came out of the AX implementation. So the title of the document is currently going to change when we go to 02, and the title will be DRIP Entity Tags, Registration, and Lookup. And this is mainly the primary focus of the draft. It's lookup and registration of DEETs and other information associated around the DEET. DRIP is not bound to DNS, EPP, or RDAP. I think there might have been a little bit of a misconception that this was going to be the only way for it to work. No, that wasn't the intention. It is, we're going to use DNS, EPP, and RDAP as a baseline to get something out the door, standardized and working for deploying. And then also, DRIP is not exactly bound to the DEET. It's just come up in previous meetings. There has been no other solution being put forward. But if one does come later in the registries, the registration architecture that we currently have is strongly tied to the DRIP entity tags HID structure, the RAA HDA split. So if someone wants to write another registry draft, either one, they need to mimic the HID in their identifier, or two, produce a whole new registration architecture using their new identifier format and hierarchy. And that's a bridge we will go across if we need to, but I tried to make it so that the document was clear that this ties with the DEET, and if something else comes along, it would be a different draft. So pending issues, there was a error on my part when I pushed. I was asked to do a contributor section. I accidentally copied and pasted the full acknowledgement section into the contributors section. So Scott Hollenbeck was pulled into the contributors section, and I didn't realize that I had done this. So he has been pulled back out in a running version that's on my side, and he's back as an acknowledgement. Andre was pulled as a contributor. Speaking of Andre, I actually oversighted and lost his text email a couple months ago. I found it again, so I have the text again, and I will be adding it in per Andre's presentation a little bit earlier. I don't know if this is an appendix or if it's going in line. I believe it's an appendix, and that's where I'm going to put it for now, and then we'll go from there. Scott Hollenbeck on the mailing list gave a really great suggestion in breaking the EPP and RDAP sections out into separate documents. I like the suggestion, but I want to feel the working group out to see if we want to do such a thing and add more documents to the listing. I need to work with Bob, and I've already discussed it with him about pulling text for the RAA and HDA into this draft. So hopefully that will happen in the next couple of weeks, and then I'll push O2 out. So the rest of this time, well, actually, Bob, let's take your question because I have plenty of time.
Just quickly, that comment about moving text from RID to registries. Just like I move text from RID to auth, we start with the text in RID to get it kind of laid out, and once the where it belongs started evolving, we move the text. So Adam and I will, once again, just we do with auth, we'll be pulling text out of RID and moving it where it belongs in registries. So everything I think will be cool for everybody on there, and that'll show up in the my next draft, the RID 18 draft, and Adam's next draft on registries.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of the 15 minutes of this to go over some registration process stuff. This is the first time I think this has been presented to the working group. This has been internal to, well, basically myself and Stu for the past year. And I'm finally getting the chance to kind of go a little bit more in detail to it. So just as a recap, this is our registry tree diagram. This is how the registries are laid out in hierarchy. We have a single root registry, which takes the values of 0 and 0 for the RAA and the HDA. And then there's two branches of the tree. There's a branch on the left that consists of the IRM and the MRA, which is mostly dealing with serial numbers, and then the branch on the right, which deals with other RAAs, mostly under civil aviation authorities, and they have values of RAAs greater than 2 and HDAs greater than 1. And then, of course, an unmanned aircraft would register with two different registries in the system, one for its serial number and one for its session ID. And then with broadcast rate going to the observer, and then DNS and RDAP lookups happening over the internet. So we have three major typical registration operations: the serial number registration at the manufacturer into the MRA, and that's usually a DEET encoded as an ANSI CTA 2063-A serial number, and this is documented in the DEET draft that Bob has. There's an operator registration at what is nominally would be considered a USS, but it's actually specifically the remote ID registry portion of DRIP. And this key and DEET would be used by the operator during session ID registration. And then finally, session ID registration, also at that USS or that remote ID registry. And that is a DEET proposed to be used by the UA during flight for that given flight. So this is a Z diagram. It's not perfect. There are some issues with this that I like to fix, but to get us started. So this is serial number registration into the MRA, or the Manufacturer's Registry of Aircraft. Basically, at the start of time, the manufacturer would build an unmanned aircraft. They most likely will generate the key pair and the DRIP entity tag associated with that unmanned aircraft. If the unmanned aircraft can't create the key pair itself, and they would propose it to the manufacturer's registry using a self-attestation. There's some internal stuff that goes on, extracting the DRIP entity tag, checking for collisions in both the database and the DNS. So to make a comment that I've gotten from Stu recently on these slides, there's a reason that DNS and database are different or split apart on this. The database mostly holds personally identifiable information, or PII, or just other additional information. In this particular scenario, we would be holding UA information. The UA's weight, how many rotors it has, what color is it, make and model, obviously, what type of battery chemistry it has. And this is so that people can easily look that stuff up and not have to scrape web pages. Once everything is completed, though, during a registration, resource records are added into DNS, private information is added to the database, the serial number, the public key, the DRIP entity tag, and any attestations that are produced are pushed into the unmanned aircraft in a secure element, hopefully. So this is 2 examples. These are pulled from the DRIP registry draft as it stands right now. On the left is an EPP command for registering a serial number. And as you can see, all of the fields here are, make, model, color, material, those kinds of things that would end up in the database. And then on the right is our inputs and our outputs, and also our DNS entries, what fields of DNS exist, or what resource records in DNS exist for a given serial number. Now, while the serial number is useful and we can create a serial number using a DEET, and that helps for modules, the real important one for DRIP is the session ID, which is what the DEET is acting as. It's acting as a UAS session ID. So a very similar process happens with a session ID. Hopefully the aircraft can create their own key pair in this scenario. So basically the operator would poke the aircraft, it would generate its key pair, send it along with a serial number and additional information around back to the operator, who acts as basically a middleman between the aircraft and the registry software, passing it back and forth. We have the same kinds of checks for collision checking with the DEETs in all the varying parts. And once it's done, importantly for this, the broadcast attestation is generated. And this is vital, as in DRIP, we require that the broadcast attestation be sent over the air in the authentication message. This is what the auth draft is all about. And this is where that broadcast attestation comes from. And this is all handed back to the unmanned aircraft through the operator. There are other ways to cut this cake. We could have the unmanned aircraft reach through an LTE connection right to the remote ID registry. That is a valid way of doing it. This is just one of many different ways to do this process. Again, this is some examples. So on the left, which is not the same as the last slide, these are the DNS entries that would be in the remote ID registry, along with what inputs and outputs were needed for the registration to occur. And then on the right is the EPP, is an example of the EPP that is sent. There is a couple things in the EPP that we have not discussed in this working group, and one of the major things is the operational intent. The operational intent is basically the UTM link back into UTM to get the 4D volume box if if they are participating in UTM. So some next steps on the registry draft. I want some feedback on the EPP examples. That would be absolutely lovely. I need to produce some RDAP examples. We haven't gotten into that yet. As I said before, I talked about some federations and key rollover. It's an interesting topic because we are going to have to probably federate registries. And with the HIT or the D acting as its identifier and the last 64 bits being the hash, it'll be interesting to see how this works because the HID would be the same. You could have a registry like the root registry's 00, but you could produce 2 to the 64 keys and they'll all have different hashes, but it's all technically the same registry. So I'm curious how this would affect deployment and use of the system. I don't have any free cycles to explore that topic, even on a crypto security level. So if there's any takers for that, that'd be really interesting. And we can add that text into the draft. And I hope to have an interim, not directly after this, but maybe a couple weeks, a month from now, as to focus on the Z diagrams. The 2 Z diagrams I showed you are 2 out of 22 Z diagrams that I have. And I would like to do a deep dive with the working group and anyone that's interested to understand the process and the flow that we've had in our heads for the past year and a half on how registries would work to get it into the draft a little bit better. And with that, I think I'm ready just to take some discussion if anyone has anything to discuss. For the first time, I think I am not rushed for time and I have 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Adam, and that's a great job. The timekeeping point of view. Thank you. Any questions or comments? Going, gone.
If I
Oh, sorry,
may.
Stuart's in the queue.
Yep.
Stuart.
I've only got one, and this at the moment this is mostly focused on Adam's registries draft, where there's a question of how much detail to include on EPP and RDAP as specific techniques for implementing the registries, and also to some extent on the architecture draft. I feel like we kind of have a failure to commit here. To achieve interoperability, we need specifics, and abstraction is a fine thing, but getting abstractions right takes a long time. And the bus is leaving the station with regard to regulations and manufacturers building application-specific integrated circuits and so on. So we're really going to have to come to some decisions rapidly on how much specific protocol detail to include in these documents versus how much to attempt to continue to remain abstract and then produce still more documents that will have the details. /Rand.
Bob?
The concern about the multiple HITs per RAA or HDA as being an issue. That's actually how key rollover will be achieved, and how they'll be linked into registries. So, and that was part of my original thoughts when I first came up with this idea. It's just that now Adam and I are going to have to sit down and get the done over the next 2 months, so that's in there. And it's, as Stu just said, in an implementable way.
So I'll say this to a little bit to Bob, but just as in general. So I knew that that was used for key rollover, but what struck me as interesting was that we have a root server, HDA RA0 HDA0, and there's only one of them in the registry tree. And obviously having it as a single server is a point of failure. So you would probably want to have multiple root servers, kind of like how DNS works now. The problem with that I think in our thing is like if you want to have an asymmetric key pair to generate the hit and thus the deed, etc., you would need to have a different key on every box. So if you had, say, 7 root servers, they're all going to have different key pairs. How is this managed, right? Because you don't want a malicious party joining the club just because they created a key pair. You would want to, there needs to be some sort of control on that. And this happens at every level of the registry tree. And that was where my thought of federation and interest in the key rollover and the keys came in. But it is a discussion we need to have overall.
Okay, no more comments, questions? Bob, I think you wanted to have a quick word about the status of the RID draft. I think that may have been overtaken by events, judging by the comments in the chat.
I can barely hear. I got my sound cranked all the way up, but just again, the slides for the RID that I have proposed are out there. I put the URL again in the chat. It was also on the list. Basically, there's Med has a couple things he wants me to address. They are easy to do. Work on them next week. IANA says they are going to do a review of the new IANA considerations. I added a lot of text in there, so they may have a lot of comments. But IANA and I will work that through. But I'm targeting for the end of next week to have -18 out. So if you have any comments on what I have in -17, please get them to me in the beginning of the week so I can get them included. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, so Bob. I have one more thing to add to the meeting. This is what I get for not putting it on the slide. So this is to answer Daniel a little bit earlier when Andre had finished his presentation. My intent, if all the stars align and the universe is nice to me, is that in Philadelphia at IETF114, I would like to do a demonstration of the AX implementation of UAS remote ID, and I want to do a full demonstration. I'll have an aircraft, I'll have a puck, I will create, well, I'll have the software loaded on the puck, but I will perform serial number registration and session ID registration and fly the aircraft and pick it up with the AX Android application. So I do intend to have implementation share. Also, to answer Daniel from earlier, AX has worked with another partner in UTM that was developing a remote ID application. And it was not DRIP specific, it was ASTM only, but our implementation did work with theirs. So they were able to see our identifier, we were able to see their identifier. Their side just kind of made it garbage on their UI, but that was because they didn't know how to decode it. They just took the raw bytes and just displayed them. And they were seeing all the pieces. They just didn't know what to do with all the pieces. As for with Andre, I would like to do an interop test with him. We'll coordinate that somehow. It's kind of hard to do an interop coordination when you're on the other side of the world at times, but I do intend to work with Andre and get an interop with DRIP to DRIP. Maybe 114 is the answer, maybe it isn't. I'm not quite sure, but as 114 draws closer, we'll have a better picture on that.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for the response.
Has anyone got anything else to say? I guess not. Okay, this meeting of the district working group is closed. I would like to thank the speakers and also for doing a fantastic job of keeping to the time, even though I screwed it up at the start by being unable to make MeetEcho work properly. And I would also like to thank my fellow delegate Stefan for his efforts today, and also to Eric for applying MeetEcho Clue where it was badly needed. So thank you to everybody, and hope to see you all in Philly. Cheers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
How did we manage that?
Yeah, I'd really just like to say thank you very much, Jim and Stefan.
Cheers. Much appreciated, Stu. Hope we can have a beer together in Philly.
Awesome.